My spoiled nephew demanded his inheritance at Grandpa's funeral, saying he was the only real grandchild. The estate lawyer asked him to define grandchild. My nephew Blake had been the golden child since birth. My sister Denise made sure of that. From the moment he could walk, he strutted around family gatherings like he owned everyone in the room. At 8 years old, he'd interrupt adult conversations to announce his needs. At 15, he'd take money from Grandpa's wallet because future inheritance might as well start now. At 22, he was still calling Grandpa every week asking for cash. Denise encouraged every bit of it. Blake's special. He's going places. Dad needs to support his only grandson's potential. She'd trained Blake to believe one fundamental truth. He was Grandpa's only real grandchild, the sole heir to everything. My daughter Mia didn't count because she was adopted. My other sister's kids didn't count because they were from her second marriage. Blake was the firstborn biological grandson, which in his mind meant the crown prince. Grandpa died on a Thursday. Blake showed up to the funeral in a Maserati he'd leased that morning. Told everyone at the service about his plans for Grandpa's house. That old place needs a complete remodel. I'm thinking modern. Maybe a pool out back. Tennis court where the garden is. Denise stood next to him, nodding proudly. It's what Dad would have wanted. Blake carrying on the family legacy. The estate lawyer, Mr. Crawford, scheduled the will reading for the following Monday. Blake arrived 40 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors. He walked straight to the head of the conference table and sat down. Let's make this quick. I have a meeting with a contractor at 2 about the renovations. Mr. Crawford looked confused. Renovations to what property? Blake laughed. My grandfather's estate. The house, the vacation cabin, the investment properties. I'm the only biological grandson. It all comes to me. That's how inheritance works. Mr. Crawford opened his briefcase slowly. Mr. Blake, before we proceed, can you clarify something for me? You keep saying you're the only grandson. What about Mia, Lucas, and Janet? Blake rolled his eyes. Mia's adopted. Doesn't count. Lucas and Janet are from Aunt Carol's second marriage. They're not real family. I'm the only one with actual Fletcher blood. Grandpa always said blood matters. Denise jumped in. Blake's right. Dad was very traditional about family lines. He always told Blake he was special, the one who'd carry on the Fletcher name. Mr. Crawford pulled out a document. Interesting. So, you believe biological connection to Mr. Fletcher determines inheritance? Blake leaned back in his chair. Obviously. I'm his DNA. The others are just people my aunts brought into the family. There's a difference between real family and paper family. Mr. Crawford nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, let's discuss Mr. Fletcher then. He pulled out another document. Mr. Harold Fletcher, born Harold Kowalski, legally adopted by the Fletcher family in 1951 at age 3. The room went completely still. Blake's sunglasses slipped down his nose. What? Your grandfather was adopted, Mr. Crawford continued. The Fletcher parents couldn't have children. They adopted Harold from St. Mary's Orphanage. He had no biological connection to the Fletcher bloodline. Zero Fletcher DNA, as you put it. Denise grabbed the document. This can't be right. Dad never said anything about being adopted. Mr. Crawford pulled out more papers. He was quite open about it in his legal documents. In fact, it shaped his entire estate plan. He believed family was about choice, not blood. That's why he was so delighted when your sister adopted Mia. It reminded him of his own story. Blake was turning pale. But he raised me. I was his favorite. He always said I was special. Mr. Crawford smiled slightly. Let me read from Mr. Fletcher's will. He cleared his throat. To my grandson Blake, who believes blood is everything, I leave this truth. I am not your blood. I never was. I was chosen by parents who loved me, just as Mia was chosen by parents who love her. Real family isn't about DNA. It's about showing up, caring, and contributing. Blake, you've taken from this family for 22 years without giving back once. Blake stood up, knocking his chair over. This is garbage. Even if he was adopted, I'm still his grandson through my mother. Mr. Crawford continued reading. To Blake, I also leave $1, the exact amount of genuine love and respect you've shown this family. The rest of my estate is divided as follows. The house goes to Mia, who spent every summer helping me in the garden while Blake was too important to visit. The vacation cabin goes to Lucas and Janet, who actually called me to talk, not just to ask for money. Denise was now standing too. What about me? I'm his daughter. Mr. Crawford turned the page. To my daughter Denise, who raised a son to believe he deserved everything while earning nothing, I leave my complete collection of parenting books. Perhaps reading them now will help with future grandchildren, should Blake ever learn enough responsibility to have any. Mr. Crawford pulled out one final document. The document showed a list of specific monetary gifts to various charities and community organizations that Grandpa had supported quietly for decades. Mr. Crawford read through them one by one, naming food banks and youth programs and animal shelters, each receiving $5,000. Blake's hands shook harder with every entry, watching money he'd counted as his own getting distributed to causes he'd never heard Grandpa mention. Denise's face went from pale to red, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping in her cheeks. She opened her mouth twice, but nothing came out, like her brain couldn't form words to match what she was hearing. Blake's chair scraped loud against the floor as he suddenly lunged forward, both hands reaching across the polished conference table toward the stack of papers in front of Mr. Crawford. His fingers were inches from grabbing them when Mr. Crawford smoothly pulled the entire stack back against his chest, completely calm like he'd expected exactly this reaction. Blake's momentum carried him forward, and he had to catch himself on the table edge, breathing hard. Mr. Crawford adjusted his glasses and looked at Blake with the patience of someone who'd dealt with this exact situation before. "These are copies, Mr. Blake. The originals are filed with the probate court and the county clerk's office. Destroying these documents wouldn't change anything about your grandfather's wishes or the legal distribution of his estate." Blake straightened up but kept his hands flat on the table like he was holding himself back from trying again. His sunglasses had fallen completely off now, and I could see his eyes were wet. This is complete garbage. Complete betrayal. Denise finally found her voice, and it came out as a yell that made Carol jump in her seat. How could he do this? How could Dad lie to us for 70 years? How could he pretend to be a Fletcher when he was really just some random orphan who got lucky? Mr. Crawford's expression didn't change, but his voice got quieter, which somehow made it carry more weight. "Mrs. Lockwood, your father never lied about his adoption. He was quite open about it in all his legal documents and with anyone who asked directly. He simply didn't announce it because he didn't consider it relevant to being part of the Fletcher family. He was chosen by parents who loved him, legally adopted and raised as their son. That made him as much a Fletcher as anyone born into the family name." Denise slammed her hand on the table. "But he let Blake think he was special. He let my son believe he was the only real grandson. He encouraged that." Mr. Crawford pulled out another paper. "Actually, I have notes from conversations with your father about exactly that topic. He was concerned about Blake's attitude toward Mia and your sister's children. He tried several times to correct Blake's assumptions about inheritance and family, but Blake refused to listen. Harold documented these conversations specifically because he anticipated this exact reaction. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. The words came out before I even decided to speak. Grandpa told us what mattered every single day through his actions. He showed up for the people who showed up for him. He spent time with the grandkids who actually wanted to spend time with him, not just take his money." Blake whirled on me so fast his expensive watch caught the light. "You knew. You knew about all of this and you didn't say anything. You and Dad conspired to steal my inheritance. You turned him against his own family." His voice got louder with each sentence. "You poisoned him against me because you were jealous that Mia wasn't real family." Mr. Crawford stood up, which somehow made the room feel smaller even though he wasn't a particularly tall man. "Your aunt knew nothing about the adoption revelation or the specific contents of the will until today. Harold was very clear about that in his instructions to me. He wanted Blake to hear this truth in exactly this way, at exactly this moment, to make his point about hypocrisy unmistakably clear." Blake stared at him for a long moment, his face going through about 6 different expressions. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his movements jerky like a puppet with tangled strings. He grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, then stopped. His shoulders slumped. "I drove the Maserati here. The lease payment is $3,000 a month, and I was counting on inheritance money to cover it." His voice cracked on the last word. Denise was already gathering her purse, her movements sharp and angry. She followed Blake toward the door but stopped to turn back and look at me and Carol. "You haven't heard the last of this. My lawyers will contest every single word of that will. Dad was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote it." Mr. Crawford sat back down and folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Lockwood, your father anticipated that possibility as well. This will was written 5 years ago and updated annually with full medical and psychological evaluations documenting his sound mind and clear intentions. It's ironclad. Any contest will cost you tens of thousands in legal fees with virtually zero chance of success. But you're certainly welcome to try." Denise's face went red again and she opened her mouth like she was going to scream, but Blake grabbed her arm from the doorway. "Mom, let's just go." His voice sounded hollow and defeated in a way I'd never heard before. They left and the door clicked shut behind them with a soft sound that felt louder than a slam would have been. The silence in the room stretched out for maybe 10 seconds. Then Carol made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. She pressed both hands over her mouth and tears started running down her face. Lucas reached over and took one of her hands while Janet grabbed the other, and they sat there holding hands like they were anchoring each other to the table. Carol's voice came out shaky when she finally spoke. "My kids were always treated like they didn't count at family gatherings. Blake would tell them they weren't real cousins. Denise would correct people who called them Fletcher grandchildren. And Dad just watched it happen, and I thought he agreed with them. I thought he saw my kids as less than because of their father. Janet squeezed her mom's hand. He always asked about our lives when we called. He remembered things we told him and asked follow-up questions weeks later. Lucas nodded, his eyes red. He sent me a card when I got my first apartment. Just a regular card, but it said he was proud of me for being responsible. I kept it on my fridge for 2 years. Mr. Crawford waited until they'd all taken some breaths before he cleared his throat gently. I need to discuss some practical matters about the inheritance, particularly regarding Mia's property. The house comes with significant responsibilities for a 20-year-old. Would you be able to stay for about 30 minutes to go over the details? I nodded and pulled out my phone. Mia's finishing her college classes nearby. I can text her to come here. She should hear this directly from you. I typed out the message asking her to come to Mr. Crawford's office as soon as possible. Important family matter. Nothing scary, but time sensitive. She responded within seconds with a question mark emoji and then okay, be there in 30. Carol wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. Do you want us to stay, or would you rather handle this with just Mia? I thought about it for a moment. Stay if you want. This affects the whole family, and Mia might appreciate having more people here who actually care about her. Carol, Lucas, and Janet all nodded and settled back into their chairs. Mr. Crawford organized his papers into neat stacks while we waited, and I watched the clock on the wall tick through 28 minutes before the door opened. Mia came in looking confused and a little worried, her backpack still on one shoulder and her hair pulled back in the messy way she wore it for classes. She looked around at all of us and her expression shifted from confused to concerned. What happened? Is everyone okay? I stood up and guided her to the empty chair next to mine. Everyone's physically fine, but there's been some developments with Grandpa's will that you need to hear about. Mia sat down slowly, setting her backpack on the floor. Her face went through about 15 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds as I explained what had just happened, about Grandpa being adopted, about Blake's reaction, about the inheritance distribution. When I got to the part about the house, she went completely still. Wait. She looked at Mr. Crawford. I own Grandpa's house? The house with the garden where we grew tomatoes every summer? The house where he taught me about roses and proper mulching and how to tell when soil needs more nitrogen? Mr. Crawford smiled slightly. Yes, Miss Mia. The house and all its contents are yours, as specified in your grandfather's will. He was very clear that he wanted you to have it because of exactly those memories you just mentioned. Mia sat back in her chair like someone had pushed her. Her eyes were wide and she looked at me, then at Carol, then back at Mr. Crawford. But I'm only 20. I've never even paid a utility bill before. How am I supposed to own a whole house? Mr. Crawford explained that the house came with property taxes around $6,000 a year, insurance premiums, utility costs that wouldn't stop just because she was the owner, and maintenance that old houses needed constantly. Mia nodded slowly, taking in each detail, and I watched her face shift from shock to something that looked like determination mixed with fear. She asked about selling it, whether that would be easier than trying to manage everything at 20 years old. Mr. Crawford said she absolutely could sell, but Harold had hoped she'd keep the place because of what it represented, because of the garden they'd built together over all those summers. Mia's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her hands against her face. She whispered that she missed him so much, that she wished she could thank him for seeing her as real family when Blake spent years making her feel like she didn't belong. Mr. Crawford's expression softened and he leaned forward slightly. He told her that maintaining the garden Harold loved would be thanks enough, that living in that house and caring for what he built would honor his memory better than any words could. Mia wiped her eyes and nodded, then asked what she needed to do first, what paperwork had to be filed, when she could actually access the property. Mr. Crawford pulled out a folder and started walking her through the process, explaining about title transfers and estate processing timelines, and I sat there watching my daughter handle this massive responsibility with more maturity than I'd expected. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes as Mr. Crawford outlined next steps and timelines. Carol and her kids left with copies of their own paperwork for the cabin, and Mia and I stayed to sign initial documents. By the time we walked out to the parking lot, my phone had already started buzzing with texts from Blake. The first one said he needed to talk immediately, that this was all a huge mistake. The second one claimed he was going to be homeless without the inheritance money. The third one switched to threats about getting lawyers involved. I showed Mia the messages, and she shook her head, looking tired. She said Blake never once cared about her until she got something he wanted, and now suddenly he needed help from the adopted cousin he'd dismissed for years. I drove her back to campus and spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my phone kept lighting up with more texts from Blake. Each message alternated between begging and threatening, between claiming he'd learned his lesson and insisting he deserved what was rightfully his. By Thursday, I'd received 18 texts and 7 voicemails. Blake's voice got more desperate with each message, talking about eviction notices and past due rent, about how Grandpa would have wanted me to help him. Friday morning brought 3 more texts before 9 o'clock, and the last one said I needed to do the right thing and give him what he deserved as the real grandson. I blocked his number after that 5th message, unable to handle the constant barrage of manipulation disguised as desperation. Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang while I was folding laundry. I opened it to find Denise standing there with a man in an expensive suit holding a briefcase. She pushed past me into my living room before I could say anything, and the lawyer followed her inside. He introduced himself as someone Denise had retained to handle the estate dispute, then pulled out a formal letter threatening to contest the will on grounds of undue influence. The letter claimed Harold wasn't in his right mind when he wrote the will, that someone had manipulated him against his real family. I stood there reading this garbage while Denise paced around my living room talking about how her father would never have done this on his own, how someone must have poisoned his mind against Blake. I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Crawford, explaining the situation in short sentences, while Denise's lawyer watched me with a blank expression. Mr. Crawford said he'd be there within the hour and told me not to sign anything or agree to anything until he arrived. I told Denise and her lawyer they could wait or leave, but I wasn't discussing this without my own legal representation present. Denise started yelling about how I was being difficult, how family should work together instead of fighting, how Blake was suffering while I stood by and did nothing. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm and suggested they wait, probably recognizing that her emotional outburst wasn't helping their case. Mr. Crawford arrived 53 minutes later carrying his own briefcase and looking completely calm. He greeted Denise politely, nodded at her lawyer, then asked to see the letter threatening to contest the will. He read it slowly while standing in my living room, then pulled out his own documents from his briefcase. He laid out medical records showing Harold had been evaluated by 2 different doctors within 6 months of updating his will, both confirming he was mentally sharp and fully competent. He showed documentation of Harold's clear intentions written in his own handwriting, explaining exactly why he was distributing his estate the way he chose. He produced witness statements from Harold's friends and neighbors describing his sound mind and deliberate choices. Mr. Crawford went through each piece of evidence methodically, demolishing every argument in the contest letter with calm precision. Denise's lawyer picked up each document, examined it, made notes on a legal pad. After 20 minutes of this, he set down his pen and turned to Denise. He told her quietly that contesting this will would cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees with virtually no chance of success, that the documentation was too strong and the will too carefully constructed. Denise's face went red and she started arguing with him, insisting there had to be a way, that her father couldn't have meant to do this to Blake. Her lawyer repeated that the evidence was overwhelming, that Harold clearly knew exactly what he was doing and why. Denise fired him right there in my living room, told him he was useless, and she'd find someone else who actually wanted to help her family. The lawyer gathered his papers, wished me good luck, and left. Denise turned on me and started screaming that I'd turned the whole family against her, that I was enjoying watching Blake suffer, that I'd probably been planning this for years. Mr. Crawford stepped between us and firmly told Denise she needed to leave my property immediately. She stormed out, slamming my door hard enough to rattle the frame. 2 days later, Carol called to check on me. Her voice sounded tired, and she admitted she'd been struggling with complicated feelings about Dad's will since the reading. She said she was grateful for the validation, grateful that someone finally acknowledged her kids as real family, but also sad that it took his death to expose all the family problems that had existed for years. We talked for almost 2 hours about Blake's behavior at holidays, about Denise's constant excuses, about the way family gatherings always centered around what Blake wanted. Carol remembered a Thanksgiving when Blake was 16 and demanded the best parking spot, the biggest serving of turkey, the first choice of dessert. Denise had made everyone else wait while Blake got what he wanted, and Carol's kids had stood in the kitchen watching while Blake acted like a prince at his own coronation. Carol said she'd spent years making excuses to her children about why their cousin got special treatment, trying to protect them from feeling less valued. Now her kids were adults, and they remembered every slight, every time Blake got priority, every family event that revolved around his needs. She felt guilty for not standing up to Denise years ago, for letting the pattern continue because it seemed easier than fighting. I told her we'd all made that choice, that we'd all gone along with it to keep peace, and now we were dealing with the consequences of years of enabling. The following Saturday, Mia and I drove to Grandpa's house to assess what she'd actually inherited. I had a key that Harold had given me years ago for emergencies, and using it now felt strange knowing he'd never be inside waiting. We walked through the front door into the living room where his favorite chair still sat by the window, a book still open on the side table like he'd just stepped away for a moment. The house smelled like him, like coffee and old wood and the lavender sachets he kept in the closets. Mia moved through each room slowly, touching things, picking up photos, opening drawers. She found his reading glasses on the kitchen counter and held them carefully like they might break. We went out the back door to the garden and Mia stopped completely when she saw it. 2 weeks of neglect had already taken a visible toll. Weeds were pushing up through the vegetable beds, the roses needed deadheading, the tomato plants were drooping from lack of water. Mia walked straight to the nearest bed and dropped to her knees, pulling weeds with tears running down her face. She worked methodically, clearing one section and then moving to the next, and I watched her hands move with the same careful attention Harold had taught her. She didn't say anything, just kept pulling weeds and wiping her eyes with her forearm, and I knew she was crying for more than just neglected plants. After an hour, we moved to the potting shed where Harold kept his tools and supplies. Mia was looking for the watering schedule he'd always followed, the notes about which plants needed what care. Instead, she found a stack of garden journals going back 30 years. Each one was filled with Harold's neat handwriting documenting what he'd planted, what thrived, what failed, observations about weather and soil and pest control. Mia sat on the floor of the shed and started reading, flipping through pages that chronicled decades of patient work. She found entries about teaching her to garden when she was 7 years old, notes about how patient she was as a child, how she never rushed through tasks like other kids. Harold had written that she reminded him of himself learning from his adoptive parents, that same careful attention to doing things right. Mia read those entries out loud with her voice breaking, and then she closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. She said she hadn't known he'd written about her, hadn't realized he'd documented their time together like it mattered enough to record. I told her that of course it mattered, that those summers had clearly meant as much to him as they did to her. She opened another journal and found more entries, years of notes about her growth and questions and developing skills. Harold had tracked her progress like a proud teacher watching a student master difficult lessons. Monday morning, Baptiste Howard arrived to assess the house's condition. Mia had scheduled him through a contractor referral service, wanting an honest evaluation before making any decisions about repairs. Baptiste walked through every room with a tablet, making notes, taking photos, occasionally stopping to examine something more closely. He checked the roof from inside the attic, tested outlets, ran water in all the sinks and showers, inspected the foundation. After 2 hours, he sat down with us at the kitchen table and delivered his assessment. The house needed significant work, probably $40,000 worth of updates to bring everything up to current standards. The roof had maybe 3 years left before it needed replacement. The plumbing was old and showing signs of corrosion. The electrical system was outdated and potentially hazardous. He showed us photos of problems we couldn't see, explaining each issue and why it mattered. Mia's face went pale as the number kept climbing, and when he finished, she admitted she had maybe $3,000 in savings from part-time jobs during college. Baptiste nodded sympathetically and said he understood, that inheriting property often came with unexpected financial burdens. He offered to break the work into phases so she could tackle the most urgent repairs first, but even the immediate necessities would cost $15,000 minimum. That evening, Mr. Crawford called with information that made Mia cry with relief. He explained that Harold had set aside funds specifically for house maintenance, a separate account that contained $60,000 earmarked for repairs and property taxes. The money would cover all the immediate repairs Baptiste had identified, plus 2 full years of property taxes and insurance. Mia started laughing through her tears, saying of course Grandpa had thought of everything. Of course he'd planned ahead to make sure she wouldn't be overwhelmed. Mr. Crawford said Harold had been very thorough in his estate planning, anticipating exactly these kinds of practical challenges. He'd wanted Mia to have the house without the financial stress that might force her to sell it before she was ready. The maintenance fund would give her time to figure out her long-term plans without desperate pressure. Mia thanked Mr. Crawford about 5 times, her voice still shaky with relief, and after she hung up, she sat on my couch staring at the ceiling. She said she felt like Grandpa was still taking care of her even though he was gone, still making sure she had what she needed. 3 days later, Blake posted a long rant on social media about being robbed of his inheritance by an adopted cousin and a grandfather who betrayed his real family. He called Harold woke and accused him of abandoning traditional family values for political correctness. The post went on for paragraphs about blood rights and biological connections, about how adoption shouldn't count the same as real family bonds. Within 2 hours, people who'd actually known Harold started commenting with their own stories. A neighbor wrote about Blake borrowing $200 3 years ago and never paying it back despite repeated requests. A former family friend described Blake showing up to Harold's 75th birthday party an hour late, staying 20 minutes and leaving early to meet friends at a bar. Someone else shared a story about Blake asking Harold for money to invest in a business opportunity, then using the cash to lease a sports car. The comments kept coming, each one adding another example of Blake's entitlement and Harold's patience. By evening, Blake had deleted the post, but screenshots were already circulating among family and friends who'd seen the original rant and the devastating responses that followed. My phone rang at 7 in the morning. Denise's number. I let it go to voicemail. She called back immediately. Then again. On the 4th call, I answered because I knew she wouldn't stop. She didn't even say hello before launching into her speech about fairness and family unity, and how I needed to talk sense into Mia about sharing the inheritance properly with Blake. I told her the will was legal and final. She switched tactics, saying she was going to call Mom and get her to make me see reason. I hung up and went back to my coffee. 2 hours later, Mom called. I braced myself for the lecture about keeping the peace, about being the bigger person, about family harmony. Instead, Mom asked if I'd heard from Denise yet. I said yes, briefly. Mom sighed and told me Denise had spent 40 minutes on the phone trying to convince her that Harold's will was unfair, that Blake deserved his share, that I needed to pressure Mia into splitting everything evenly. Mom had listened to the whole rant, then told Denise that Harold's will was perfectly fair and maybe she should actually read those parenting books he left her. Denise had hung up on her. Mom said she'd been watching Blake's behavior at family gatherings for 22 years, and the will didn't surprise her one bit. She asked how Mia was handling everything. I told her Mia was meeting with a financial advisor that afternoon to understand what she'd inherited. Mom said that showed more maturity than Blake had demonstrated in his entire life. Mia met with Caitlin Rivers at 3 o'clock in a small office downtown. I drove her there because she was nervous about the whole thing. Caitlin was maybe 40, wearing a practical suit and no-nonsense glasses. She shook Mia's hand and got straight to business, pulling out folders and spreadsheets and property documents. She walked Mia through the tax implications, the insurance requirements, the maintenance costs, the decision points about whether to live in the house or rent it out. Mia took notes in a spiral notebook, asking questions about every single thing Caitlin mentioned. Caitlin looked impressed. She said most 20-year-olds in Mia's position just wanted to know how fast they could sell everything and get cash. Mia said she didn't want to sell Grandpa's house. She wanted to take care of it the way he'd taken care of it for 50 years. Caitlin smiled for the first time and said that was exactly the right attitude for managing real property. They spent 2 hours going over numbers and options and long-term planning. When we left, Mia looked exhausted but determined. Lucas called me that evening while I was making dinner. His voice was shaking. He and Janet had driven up to see the vacation cabin they'd inherited. They'd expected a rundown place that needed work. Instead, they found a well-maintained cabin full of photos. Photos of them with Grandpa from visits over the years, fishing trips, hiking trails, birthday celebrations at the cabin. Janet got on the phone, crying so hard she could barely talk. She said Blake had never been there, not once in all the years they'd been visiting. They found a letter from Harold in the kitchen, sealed in an envelope with both their names on it. The letter explained that he wanted them to have a place where their own families could make memories someday, that the cabin represented the family they'd chosen to build with him through consistent visits and genuine care. Lucas said they'd spent 3 hours looking at photos and crying. He thanked me for being a good sister to Carol, for raising Mia right, for not being like Denise. The next morning, I went to Grandpa's house to start going through his personal papers. Mia needed to understand what she'd inherited beyond just the property value. The house felt empty without him. I started in his study, opening drawers and filing cabinets. I found tax records, insurance documents, maintenance receipts going back decades. Then I found a wooden box in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were letters, dozens of letters in Harold's handwriting, addressed to no one, dated across 40 years. I sat on the floor and started reading. The letters were Harold processing his feelings about being adopted. He wrote about the day the Fletcher parents chose him from the orphanage. He wrote about growing up knowing he was picked, selected, wanted. He wrote about how being adopted made him more careful about family, more aware that love required action and intention. One letter from 15 years ago talked about the day I told him I was adopting Mia. He wrote that he cried with joy because I understood what he'd always known, that the best families are built through choice and commitment. He wrote about watching Mia in his garden, teaching her about plants, seeing her patience and care. He wrote that she reminded him of himself at that age, learning from parents who chose to love him. I packed the letters carefully to show Mia later. That afternoon, Blake showed up at the house. I was in the kitchen sorting through Grandpa's cookbooks when I heard a car door slam. I looked out the window and saw Blake walking toward the front door like he owned the place. Mia was upstairs going through the bedrooms. I met Blake at the door before he could knock. He put on a sad face and said he just wanted to get a few things that had sentimental value, some items Grandpa promised him years ago. I told him he couldn't come in without Mr. Crawford present. Blake's expression changed instantly. The sad face disappeared and something ugly replaced it. He said Mia was a thief who stole his inheritance. He said I was a terrible mother who raised a daughter to take advantage of a confused old man. His voice got louder with each sentence. Mia appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. Mia came down the stairs slowly. Blake turned his anger toward her, listing all the reasons she didn't deserve the house. She was adopted, not real family. She'd manipulated Grandpa in his old age. She was too young and stupid to manage property. Mia stood in the hallway and looked at Blake without flinching. She said Grandpa saw exactly who Blake was and decided he didn't deserve a reward for being selfish. Blake actually laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty house. He said she was just a charity case who got lucky, that she should be grateful anyone wanted her at all. I stepped between them before I even realized I was moving. I told Blake to get out. He took a step toward me, his face red. Then headlights swept across the front windows. Mr. Crawford's car pulled into the driveway. Mr. Crawford walked up to the door with his briefcase. He looked at Blake, then at me, and seemed to understand the situation immediately. He informed Blake that he was trespassing on Mia's property and needed to leave right now or face legal consequences. Blake started arguing about his rights as family. Mr. Crawford pulled out his phone and said he could have the police here in 5 minutes. Blake backed toward his car, cursing under his breath. Then he stopped next to one of Grandpa's rose bushes, the ones he'd spent years cultivating. Blake looked right at Mia and kicked the plant over, snapping the main stem. Dirt and roots scattered across the walkway. Blake got in his car and drove away. Mia ran to the rose bush and dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to figure out how to save it. The next day, Mr. Crawford recommended we talk to Elise Thorne. She was a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes and family inheritance conflicts. We met her at her office downtown. Elise listened to the whole story about Blake's behavior, the threats, the property damage. She took notes and asked specific questions about dates and witnesses. She said she'd handled cases like this before. Entitled relatives often got worse before they accepted reality. She recommended filing a restraining order immediately based on Blake's trespassing and destruction of property. She walked us through the process, explaining what evidence we needed and how the order would work. Mia signed the paperwork with steady hands. Elise said the order should be in place within 48 hours. She warned us that Blake might try something else before the order took effect, and we should document everything and call the police if he showed up again. That evening, Mia told me she was taking a semester off from college. I felt my stomach drop. She was doing so well in her classes, and I didn't want Grandpa's death to derail her education. Mia explained that she needed time to handle the house repairs and figure out her long-term plans for the property. She said college would still be there next semester, but right now she had decisions to make about something that could provide stability for decades if she managed it correctly. She'd already talked to her academic advisor about taking a leave. I argued that she shouldn't let the inheritance disrupt her life. Mia pointed out that the inheritance was part of her life now, a significant part, and she needed to handle it responsibly, instead of trying to juggle everything and doing it all badly. She had a point, but I still worried she was making a mistake. We hired Baptiste Howard to start the repairs. He showed up on Monday morning with his truck and his tools. Baptiste was patient in a way I hadn't expected from a contractor. He walked Mia through every single repair, explaining why things needed to be fixed and how he planned to fix them. Mia followed him around the house with her spiral notebook, writing down everything he said. She asked questions about roof flashing and circuit breakers and foundation drainage. Baptiste answered each question like it mattered, like teaching a 20-year-old about her house was just as important as doing the actual repairs. He showed her how to spot water damage, how to check if outlets were grounded, how to tell if the furnace was running efficiently. Mia absorbed it all, taking pages of notes. Baptiste told me later that most homeowners never bothered to understand their own houses. They just called him when something broke. He said Mia was going to be the kind of owner who caught problems early because she actually knew what to look for. The repairs took 3 weeks, and I spent most of that time watching Mia become someone I barely recognized. She showed up every morning at 7 to check Baptiste's progress, asked questions about load-bearing walls and electrical codes, took notes in that spiral notebook until her hand cramped. Baptiste started bringing her coffee because she was always there before him. The house slowly transformed from a place full of Grandpa's things into Mia's home, and I saw her claiming it one decision at a time. Carol called on a Saturday morning asking if she could bring Lucas and Janet over to help sort through Grandpa's belongings. Mia agreed immediately, and I watched the 3 of them work through closets and drawers with a gentleness that surprised me. They found his old clothes, his collection of gardening magazines, boxes of tax returns from 40 years ago. Lucas discovered a fireproof box under the bed in the spare room, locked with a combination none of us knew. Mia tried Grandpa's birthday, then her birthday, then random numbers until the box finally clicked open on March 15th, the date he was adopted. Inside were papers, official documents with stamps and signatures, and Lucas pulled them out carefully like they might crumble. St. Mary's Orphanage letterhead at the top, Harold Kowalski written in neat script, then crossed out and replaced with Harold Fletcher. The adoption decree dated March 15, 1951, signed by a judge whose signature had faded to almost nothing. We sat on the floor passing the documents around, reading every word. There were medical records from when he was 3 years old, noting he was healthy but underweight. A letter from the orphanage director describing him as quiet and well-behaved. The Fletcher parents' application explaining they'd tried for years to have children and wanted to give a child a loving home. Janet started crying first, then Mia, then me. Carol just held the papers and stared at them like they explained everything about our family. Lucas found photos tucked into the box. Harold as a tiny child in clothes that didn't fit right. Then Harold with the Fletcher parents looking stiff and formal in their Sunday best. Then Harold smiling in a backyard somewhere with a puppy. We spent 2 hours on that floor reading through his entire adoption file, and it felt like meeting Grandpa for the first time. He'd been chosen, documented, officially welcomed into a family that wanted him. Carol said it made sense now why he cared so much about Mia, why he left her the house. He understood what it meant to be chosen and loved on purpose. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at my house addressed to Mr. Crawford but forwarded to me. Denise's lawyer had sent it, claiming Harold was mentally incompetent when he wrote the will, that his adoption trauma affected his judgment, that the will should be invalidated. I called Mr. Crawford immediately, and he sounded tired when he answered. He said he'd been expecting this, that Denise had contacted 3 different lawyers before finding one willing to take the case. Mr. Crawford asked me to come to his office the next morning, and when I arrived, he had a stack of documents spread across his desk. Medical records from Harold's doctor showing he'd passed a cognitive assessment 6 months before he died, scoring higher than average for his age. Letters from his financial advisor confirming he understood his estate planning decisions. A psychological evaluation he'd requested specifically to prevent this exact challenge, dated and notarized. Mr. Crawford had already prepared a response to Denise's lawyer, attaching all the evidence of Harold's sound mind and clear intentions. He showed me the letter before sending it, and it was professional but devastating, laying out exactly how prepared Harold had been for someone to question his competence. Mr. Crawford said he'd seen families tear themselves apart over inheritance before, but he'd rarely seen someone as thoughtful as Harold in preventing it. The will wasn't written in anger, it was written in clarity, and every word had been chosen carefully. He mailed the response that afternoon, and I knew Denise would receive it within days. I started seeing Ashlyn 3 times a week because I couldn't process everything alone anymore. My dad was dead, my sister was suing his estate, my nephew had become someone I didn't recognize, and my daughter had inherited a house at 20. Ashlyn's office was small and comfortable, filled with plants and soft furniture that made it easier to talk. She asked questions that made me think about things I'd been avoiding. Why did Harold's will feel cruel to Denise when it was just honest? Because honesty destroys the stories people tell themselves to feel good. Denise had spent 22 years believing she was raising a special child who deserved special treatment, and Harold's will said no, you raised an entitled adult who takes without giving. That truth felt like cruelty, because it stripped away the narrative Denise had built. Ashlyn helped me see that polite silence had enabled Blake's behavior for years, that every time someone didn't call him out, they gave him permission to continue. Harold's will wasn't mean. It was the first time anyone had told Blake and Denise the truth without softening it. I cried in Ashlyn's office more than I'd cried in years, grieving not just for my dad, but for the family relationships that were breaking apart. She reminded me that some relationships were built on dysfunction, and when someone finally sets boundaries, those relationships can't survive because they were never healthy to begin with. I left each session feeling raw but clearer, like I was finally seeing my family without the protective blur I'd always used. Mia started planting in early May, following Grandpa's garden journal like an instruction manual. She measured out rows for tomatoes, marked spaces for peppers and cucumbers, created a small herb section near the kitchen door. Neighbors I'd never met started appearing in the backyard, introducing themselves and sharing memories of Harold. The woman from 3 houses down said he'd fixed her fence after a storm and refused payment. The couple across the street said he'd helped them plant their maple tree 15 years ago and checked on it every spring. A man from the next block over said Harold had taught his son how to change a tire when the kid was 16 and stranded. Mia absorbed these stories while she worked the soil, learning that Grandpa had been showing up for people all over the neighborhood for decades. Nobody had asked him to help. He just noticed what needed doing and did it. The neighbors brought her seedlings and advice, telling her which varieties grew best in this soil, warning her about the rabbits that would eat her lettuce if she didn't fence it properly. Mia took notes on everything, building relationships the same way Grandpa had, through consistency and genuine care. I watched her become part of the neighborhood in ways I'd never managed, and I realized she was inheriting more than just property. Blake's social media posts started getting worse in June. He posted long rants about adoption activists destroying traditional families, about blood rights being erased by political correctness, about grandparents being brainwashed into rejecting their real grandchildren. He shared articles about inheritance laws and family lineage, adding comments about how adopted children were stealing from biological families. People started commenting, some agreeing, but most questioning his sanity. Several relatives blocked him after he posted a photo of Grandpa with a caption about betrayal and fake families. Carol called to tell me that even Denise's closest friends were privately saying Blake needed professional help, that his posts were becoming scary. Denise defended him in the comments at first, but eventually she stopped responding, and I wondered if she was finally seeing what everyone else had seen for years. Blake's posts got more frequent and more desperate. sometimes 3 or 4 a day, each one angrier than the last. I stopped checking his page after he posted a long thread about how Mia had manipulated an old man and stolen his inheritance through emotional manipulation. Reading his words made me feel sick, and I knew nothing I said would change his mind. The insurance transfer finished in July, and Mia officially became the homeowner on every legal document. She framed the deed in a simple black frame and hung it in the kitchen where Grandpa used to keep family photos. The wall looked empty with just one frame, but Mia said she was starting her own tradition, her own collection of important documents and memories. She took a photo of the framed deed and sent it to Lucas and Janet, and they sent back photos of themselves at the cabin holding their own deed. The three of them had created a group chat, sharing updates about their properties and making plans to visit each other. Mia told me it felt strange to own something this significant at 20, but also right, like Grandpa had known exactly what she needed to grow up. She started making decisions about the house with confidence I'd never seen before, choosing paint colors and planning renovations and budgeting for future repairs. I watched my daughter become an adult through the responsibility of ownership, and I understood why Grandpa had given her this gift. Lucas and Janet invited Mia to visit the cabin in August, and she drove up on a Friday afternoon with a bag of groceries and nervous excitement. She called me that first evening from the cabin's porch, and I could hear Lucas and Janet laughing in the background. They'd spent the afternoon hiking the trails Grandpa used to take them on, and they'd found his initials carved into a tree from 30 years ago. The cabin was smaller than Mia expected, but perfect, with 2 bedrooms and a main room that smelled like pine. They cooked dinner together and stayed up late talking about being the kids who didn't count, the ones Blake and Denise had dismissed as not real family. Lucas said he'd spent years wondering if he actually belonged at family gatherings, if he was just tolerated because of his mom. Janet admitted she'd avoided holiday dinners sometimes because she was tired of Blake's comments about second marriages and step-families. Mia told them about growing up hearing that adopted kids weren't real family. That blood was what mattered. The three of them cried and laughed and made plans to maintain the cabin together, to create memories in the place Grandpa wanted them to have. Mia came home on Sunday evening looking lighter, like she'd finally found people who understood what it meant to be chosen instead of born into a family. Denise showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning in September, without Blake and without warning. She looked smaller than I remembered, older and tired. She asked if we could talk, and I let her in, but stayed standing near the door. Denise admitted she was struggling financially because she'd been supporting Blake's lifestyle for years, paying his rent when he couldn't, covering his car payments, buying his groceries. She'd spent her savings and maxed out credit cards believing he'd eventually get stable and pay her back. Now she had nothing left and Blake was still asking for money. I felt sorry for her, but also angry that she was coming to me now, after everything. Denise didn't ask for Mia's inheritance directly, but she hinted that maybe we could help, that family should support family. I gave her the number for a financial counselor Caitlin had recommended, and I told her clearly that Mia's inheritance wasn't available to fix Blake's problems or bail out the choices Denise had made. Denise looked like I'd slapped her, but she took the number and left without arguing. I watched her drive away and felt sad for who she'd become, someone who'd sacrificed everything for a son who would never appreciate it. Mia decided to rent out the 2 extra bedrooms in October after talking with Caitlin about income and expenses. The house had 3 bedrooms, and Mia only needed 1, and the rental income would cover the mortgage and property taxes with money left over for maintenance. Caitlin helped her set up proper lease agreements, create a separate bank account for property management, and screen potential renters carefully. Mia interviewed 5 different people before choosing 2 graduate students who seemed responsible and quiet. She set clear rules about the house, the garden, the shared spaces, and both renters agreed without hesitation. Caitlin reviewed the leases before Mia signed them, making sure everything was legal and protected Mia's interests. I watched my daughter handle this entire process with a professionalism that amazed me, and I realized Grandpa had known exactly what he was doing when he left her this property. The first renters moved in on November 1st, and Mia spent the day helping them carry boxes and showing them how everything in the house worked. Both were respectful and grateful, treating the house like it mattered because they could see it mattered to Mia. She collected first month's rent and security deposits, deposited the money in her property management account, and updated her budget spreadsheet. The rental income covered the mortgage payment with $800 left over for taxes and repairs. Mia discovered she was good at being a landlord because Grandpa had taught her about responsibility and follow-through, about showing up consistently and keeping promises. Her renters texted her when small things broke and she fixed them quickly or called Baptiste for help. The house felt alive again with people in it, and Mia told me she liked having others around, liked being responsible for creating a good home for people who needed one. The rental income changed everything for Mia because she could stop worrying about whether she'd lose the house to taxes or emergency repairs. She deposited checks from both renters on the 1st of each month, updated her budget spreadsheet, and watched the property management account grow. By December, she had enough saved to handle the winter heating bills and still put money toward the spring garden supplies. I watched her confidence grow as she realized she could actually manage this responsibility Grandpa had given her. She wasn't just inheriting property, she was building something stable that could last decades if she kept showing up and doing the work. Carol called me 3 weeks before Christmas with news about Blake. He'd been evicted from his apartment after missing 3 months of rent payments. The landlord had started the process in September, right after the will reading, and Blake had ignored every notice, assuming his inheritance money would arrive and fix everything. Now he was moving back in with Denise, hauling boxes of expensive clothes and electronics into her 2-bedroom condo. Carol heard about it from a mutual friend who lived in Denise's building and reported screaming matches echoing through the hallways at all hours. Blake blamed Denise for not fighting harder to get him his inheritance. Denise blamed Blake for spending money he didn't have on a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The golden child was discovering that his mother's enabling had limits when her own finances were stretched thin from years of bailing him out. I felt sorry for Denise in a complicated way because she was finally seeing what the rest of us had watched for years. She'd raised a son who believed the world owed him everything, and now that son was living in her guest room, eating her food and raging at her for not fixing his problems. Carol said the fights got so loud that neighbors complained to building management. Blake would storm out at midnight and disappear for days, then return demanding money for gas or food or his phone bill. Denise tried setting boundaries but had no practice enforcing them after 22 years of giving Blake whatever he wanted. She'd created this situation by teaching him that tantrums and manipulation worked, and now she couldn't make it stop. The mail arrived on a Tuesday in late January, 6 months after Grandpa's death. I found a thick envelope from Mr. Crawford's office mixed in with bills and advertisements. Inside was a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, dated 2 years before he died. The first line made my hands shake. If you're reading this, then 6 months have passed since the will reading, and I hope the dust has settled enough for you to hear what I need to say. I sat down at my kitchen table and read through tears as Grandpa explained his reasoning for the will he'd written. He knew it would cause conflict and pain. He knew Blake would react with rage and Denise would feel betrayed. He knew the family might fracture beyond repair. But he also knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth and let people decide how to respond. Grandpa wrote about watching Blake's entitlement grow year after year, while Denise made excuses and enabled every bad choice. No. He wrote about his worry that Blake would never learn responsibility if someone didn't force him to face consequences. He wrote about hoping the will would shock Blake into growth, into understanding that family requires effort and contribution, not just DNA. He acknowledged that it might not work, that Blake might double down on bitterness instead of learning humility, but he had to try because doing nothing felt like giving up on his grandson completely. The letter explained that he'd left me this message because he trusted me to help Mia navigate her inheritance, while also understanding that tough love comes from actual love, not cruelty. I cried reading Grandpa's words because they were so honest about the pain he knew he'd cause. He wrote that he'd struggled with the decision for years, wondering if he should just divide everything equally and let the family continue with its dysfunction intact. But he kept coming back to the truth that enabling Blake's behavior wasn't helping him. It was destroying him. Grandpa wrote that he hoped 6 months had been enough time for Blake to hit bottom and start climbing back up, but if not, at least everyone would know where they stood. He ended the letter by saying he loved all of us, even Blake, and that real love sometimes means letting people experience the consequences of their choices instead of protecting them from reality. Mia decided to throw a garden party in early March to thank everyone who'd helped her through the transition. She spent 2 weeks planning, cleaning the house, and preparing the garden for visitors. She sent invitations to the neighbors who'd shared memories of Grandpa, to the contractors who'd helped with repairs, to Carol's family, to my mother, to the financial advisor and the real estate attorney who'd guided her through the legal maze. She specifically did not invite Blake or Denise because their presence would turn a celebration into a confrontation. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon when the early spring flowers were just starting to bloom in the beds Grandpa had planted. 50 people showed up, filling the house and spilling into the backyard where Mia had set up tables and chairs. Carol arrived with Lucas and Janet, who immediately started exploring the garden and taking photos of the new growth. My mother brought a photo album of Grandpa from when he was young, just starting to build his own garden in this same yard. Caitlin came with her partner and spent an hour talking to Mia about long-term financial planning and property investment strategies. Baptiste arrived with his wife and walked through the house, pointing out all the repairs he'd completed, proud of the work they'd done together. Neighbors brought food and stories, creating a potluck of memories and gratitude that filled the rooms where Grandpa had lived for 50 years. People started sharing stories about Harold without any prompting, and a pattern emerged that none of us had fully recognized while he was alive. The neighbor from 3 houses down talked about the time Grandpa spent 2 weekends helping him build a wheelchair ramp for his mother without being asked or expecting payment. A woman from the community garden mentioned how Harold had taught her everything about tomatoes when she was struggling to grow anything in her first plot. The postal carrier who delivered mail on this route for 20 years remembered Harold always offering water on hot days and asking about his family. Story after story painted a picture of a man who believed family was something you built through consistent care, through showing up when people needed help, through remembering birthdays and asking follow-up questions about problems people had mentioned weeks before. Mia stood in the kitchen listening to these stories with tears running down her face because she was understanding something bigger than just inheriting a house. She'd inherited a legacy of intentional love, of choosing to care about people through actions instead of just words. Grandpa hadn't been special because of his DNA or his accomplishments or his money. He'd been special because he'd shown up consistently for decades, building relationships through patience and genuine interest in other people's lives. The house and garden weren't just property. They were physical evidence of a man who believed you create family by planting seeds and tending them carefully year after year until they grow into something that sustains everyone around you. A letter arrived for Mia in April, handwritten on expensive paper in Blake's careful script. I was at her house when she opened it and we read it together at the kitchen table. Blake apologized for his behavior at the will reading and in the month since. He acknowledged that he'd been wrong about what made someone real family. He claimed he'd learned his lesson about entitlement and wanted to start over with Mia, to build a real relationship based on mutual respect. The apology sounded genuine until the third paragraph, where Blake mentioned how much he'd always loved this house and how he'd be happy to help Mia maintain it if she ever needed someone to stay here and watch the place. The subtext was clear even though Blake tried to hide it. He wanted back into the house, wanted to live rent-free in the property he'd expected to inherit, wanted to benefit from Grandpa's legacy without actually changing his behavior or beliefs. Mia showed me the letter without saying anything, just watching my face as I read through Blake's carefully constructed manipulation. We both recognized what he was doing because Grandpa had taught us to pay attention to actions instead of words, to notice what people actually do instead of what they claim they'll do. Blake's apology focused entirely on what he wanted, not on the harm he'd caused. He never mentioned the years of dismissing Mia as not real family. He never acknowledged the cruelty of his comments at the funeral and will reading. He never took responsibility for his entitlement or his treatment of people who'd actually cared about Grandpa. The letter was just another attempt to get what Blake believed he deserved, wrapped in language that sounded like growth, but was really the same manipulation he'd always used. Mia spent 2 days thinking about how to respond before she sat down and wrote a brief note back to Blake. She thanked him for his letter and said she wished him well in his journey of personal growth. She wrote that she wasn't interested in building a relationship with someone who only valued her after she inherited property he'd wanted for himself. She explained that real relationships require consistent care over time, not sudden interest when circumstances change. She ended by saying she hoped he would genuinely learn the lessons Grandpa had tried to teach through the will, but that learning had to happen on Blake's own timeline and wasn't her responsibility to manage or support. The note was clear and kind, setting a boundary without cruelty, and I felt proud watching my 20-year-old daughter handle manipulation with more maturity than many adults ever develop. Baptiste finished the last repairs in May, 3 months ahead of his original estimate and $2,000 under budget. He walked through the house with Mia one final time, pointing out everything they'd accomplished together. New roof that would last 30 years, updated electrical that met current code, plumbing that wouldn't leak or burst, foundation drainage that would prevent water damage, HVAC system that would heat and cool efficiently. Baptiste told Mia she'd been one of his most engaged clients ever, actually learning about her property, instead of just writing checks and hoping contractors would handle everything. She'd asked questions about every repair, taken notes about maintenance schedules, and understood that owning property meant taking responsibility for understanding how everything worked. She already had plans for future improvements and a 10-year maintenance schedule that would keep the house in excellent condition. Lucas called me in June with news about the vacation cabin and plans for next summer. He and Janet wanted to host a family reunion at the property Grandpa had left them, inviting everyone who'd actually maintained relationships with Harold over the years. Carol's family would come, my mother would come, Mia and I would come, along with neighbors and friends who'd known Grandpa and wanted to celebrate his memory. Lucas made it clear that Blake and Denise were not invited unless they genuinely apologized and demonstrated real behavior change, not just words designed to manipulate their way back into family events. It was the first time anyone in our family had set clear boundaries with actual consequences, instead of just tolerating bad behavior to avoid conflict. I spent a weekend in July going through more of Grandpa's belongings that Mia had stored in the attic, and I found a photo album I'd never seen before. The first page showed a black and white photo of a small boy standing between 2 adults outside an orphanage, everyone smiling despite the institutional building behind them. Subsequent pages documented Harold's adoption day, his childhood with the Fletcher parents, birthday parties and school events and family vacations. The album told the story of a boy who was chosen and welcomed, who grew up knowing he was wanted not because of biology, but because of deliberate love. Later pages showed Harold as a young man planting his first garden, as a new father holding my mother, as a grandfather teaching Blake and Mia and Lucas and Janet how to care for growing things. I gave the album to Mia, who studied it like a textbook on how to love intentionally, tracing the progression from chosen child to choosing father to grandfather, who chose to tell the truth even when it hurt. Denise appeared outside Mia's lecture hall in September, waiting by the door when class ended. Mia saw her and immediately turned to walk the other direction, but Denise followed, calling her name and trying to start a conversation about family and forgiveness. Other students noticed and started filming on their phones as Denise's voice got louder and more desperate. Campus security arrived within minutes because Mia had filed paperwork with the university about the restraining order after Elise had helped us get it approved by the court. 2 security officers escorted Denise off campus while she yelled about how Mia had stolen her son's inheritance and destroyed their family. Mr. Crawford filed additional legal paperwork that afternoon, and the judge extended the restraining order for another year with stricter terms and actual consequences for violations. Denise finally seemed to understand that her behavior had real limits, and that courts would enforce those limits whether she agreed with them or not. I watched Mia move through her days with a confidence I'd never seen before, handling tenant issues with the same steady approach Grandpa used for garden problems. 6 months had passed since the will reading, and she'd built routines around her classes and property management that somehow worked. She'd wake at 6 to check on the garden before her morning lecture, spend afternoons studying between handling maintenance requests, and still find time to plan improvements for the house. The girl who used to stress about chemistry exams now calmly discussed roof warranties with contractors and negotiated repair costs like she'd been doing it for years. One evening she was deadheading roses while I helped with the weeding, and she stopped to look at the garden stretching out in neat rows. She told me she finally got it. What Grandpa was teaching her all those summers when she thought they were just playing in the dirt. He was showing her that roots matter more than branches, that you build something real by working consistently at the foundation instead of just trying to look impressive on the surface. The tomatoes she planted were thriving because she'd spent weeks preparing the soil, not because she'd bought expensive plants. Carol called in early December with news that caught me off guard. Blake had gotten a job at a car dealership 3 months ago, and according to mutual friends, he was actually showing up every day and working hard. He'd sold more cars in November than anyone else on the floor, apparently charming customers with the same smooth talking he'd used to manipulate family members for years. Carol said she didn't know if he was genuinely changing or just desperate enough to fake it, but either way, it was the first time he'd held a job longer than a few weeks. Part of me wanted to believe people could change, but I'd watched Blake coast through life for too long to trust that a few months of employment meant real growth. Still, it was something. At least he wasn't calling Denise for money every week, which meant she might finally have to face her own financial situation, instead of enabling his. Mia came home from meeting with her academic advisor in January, with forms to change her major. She'd been studying business, thinking vaguely about marketing or management, but now she wanted to switch to horticulture with a minor in property management. The advisor had helped her map out a program that would let her finish in 3 years instead of 4, combining her inheritance experience with actual credentials. She spread the course descriptions across the kitchen table, pointing out classes on landscape design, soil science, and real estate law with genuine excitement. This was the first time I'd seen her passionate about school instead of just going through the motions. Grandpa's garden had given her more than property. It had given her direction. She had a clear path now that connected what she loved with practical skills she could use for decades. I started hosting dinners at Mia's house on the last Sunday of every month, inviting only the family members who actually wanted to build something healthier than what existed before. Carol brought Lucas and Janet. My mother came with homemade bread, and we'd spend hours cooking together and talking without the tension that used to poison every family gathering. No one was performing or competing. No one was making excuses for bad behavior. No one was walking on eggshells around Denise and Blake. We were creating new traditions based on showing up and contributing instead of just tolerating dysfunction to keep the peace. Lucas taught Mia how to make Grandpa's favorite soup from memory. Janet helped me organize the family photos we'd found in storage, and my mother told stories about Harold's adoption that she'd never shared before. These dinners felt like building something real instead of just maintaining something broken. The garden exploded with vegetables in late summer, producing more tomatoes and peppers and squash than Mia could possibly use. She started packing bags for the neighbors just like Grandpa did, walking down the block with fresh produce and stopping to chat about their own gardens. Mrs. Smith from next door told her she had Harold's gift for growing things, that her tomatoes tasted exactly like his used to. Mr. Rodriguez asked for advice about his struggling rose bushes, and Mia spent an hour showing him proper pruning techniques she'd learned from Grandpa's journals. She glowed with pride when people compared her to him, not because of the inheritance, but because she was carrying on his actual legacy of care and generosity. The garden wasn't just property, it was proof that she'd learned what he was teaching. A formal apology letter arrived through Mr. Crawford in September, and I almost threw it away without reading it when I saw Denise's name. But something made me open it. Maybe curiosity about what manipulation she'd try next. The letter acknowledged her role in enabling Blake's entitlement. admitted she'd defined her worth through his success, which meant excusing his failures and blaming everyone else, and said she needed to make changes in her own life. There were no requests for money, no hints about wanting back into family events, no manipulation disguised as growth. It seemed genuine in a way I'd never seen from her before. I read it 3 times looking for the angle and couldn't find one. I decided to respond cautiously, not agreeing to anything but acknowledging that I'd received it and appreciated the honesty. Mia and I met Denise at a coffee shop in October with Ashlyn present to keep things from spiraling into old patterns. Denise looked smaller somehow, less polished than usual, and she actually listened when we explained how her parenting had affected the whole family. She didn't interrupt or make excuses, didn't try to redirect blame or minimize what Blake had done. When Mia described feeling invisible at family gatherings because Blake was always the center of attention, Denise started crying and admitted she'd trained him to believe the world revolved around him because that's how she'd measured her success as a mother. If Blake was happy and confident, she was doing well. If Blake struggled or faced consequences, she'd failed. She'd spent 22 years protecting him from reality, and now he couldn't function in it. Ashlyn guided the conversation carefully, helping Denise see patterns she'd been blind to for decades. Blake wasn't invited to the mediation, and Denise accepted that without argument. She said her relationship with him needed to change before any family reconciliation was possible, that she couldn't keep enabling him and expect different results. Ashlyn had helped her find a therapist who specialized in parental enmeshment, and she'd joined a support group for parents of adult children who struggled with entitlement. Denise admitted the other parents' stories sounded exactly like her own, that she wasn't unique in raising a kid who believed he deserved everything without earning anything. She was starting to understand that helping Blake meant stopping the help, letting him face natural consequences instead of constantly rescuing him. I didn't know if she'd actually follow through, but at least she was saying the right things for the first time ever. We planned a memorial garden party for the 1-year anniversary of Grandpa's death, and Mia sent invitations to everyone whose lives Harold had touched through quiet, consistent care. The house filled with neighbors, friends, and family members who actually showed up for him over the years. We planted a new rose bush in the spot where Blake had kicked over the old one, and Mia gave a short speech about inheritance being more than money or property. She talked about learning to show up consistently, to care for growing things patiently, to build community through small acts of generosity repeated over time. She said Grandpa left her a house, but he taught her how to make it a home by demonstrating that family is something you create through action, not something you inherit through blood. People were crying by the time she finished, and we spent the afternoon sharing food and stories and memories of a man who believed in choosing love deliberately. Blake appeared at the back gate halfway through the party, sober and subdued in plain clothes without the designer labels he used to wear. He asked quietly if he could just stand in the back of the garden without interacting with anyone, and Mia looked at me before answering. I shrugged, leaving it up to her since it was her property and her decision. She considered for a long moment, then nodded and told him he could stay as long as he respected people's space. Blake spent an hour silently watching the community Grandpa had built through decades of showing up, and I saw him wipe his eyes a few times when people shared stories about Harold's kindness. He didn't try to join conversations or make it about himself, just stood there taking in what he'd missed by being too focused on what he could take instead of what he could give. The garden was emptying out as the sun dropped lower, guests saying their goodbyes and promising to visit again soon. Blake stayed in his spot by the back fence, hands shoved in his pockets, watching people leave in groups of 2 and 3. Mia was collecting empty plates from the picnic tables when he finally moved, walking slowly toward where we stood near the rose bushes. His shoulders were hunched forward in a way I'd never seen before, none of the swagger that used to announce his presence at every family gathering. He stopped a few feet away and waited until Mia looked up from stacking dishes. "I can go if you want," he said quietly. "I just wanted to say something before I left." Mia set the plates down carefully and glanced at me, then back at him. "Okay." Blake looked down at his shoes, scuffed work boots instead of the designer sneakers he used to wear. I wasted it. All those years with Grandpa, I was too busy thinking about what I could get from him to see what he was actually offering. He looked up, his eyes red. He was an incredible man, and I treated him like an ATM machine. I can't fix that now, and I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it out loud, that I know what I lost and it was my own fault. Mia crossed her arms, studying him for a long moment. The Blake I knew would have made this about himself somehow, would have found a way to ask for something while pretending not to. This version stood there waiting, accepting whatever response came without trying to control it. "I appreciate you saying that," Mia said finally, "but I'm not ready to have a relationship with you. Maybe someday if you keep working on yourself, we can be cordial family members at gatherings." Blake nodded immediately. "That's fair. I understand." He turned to leave, then paused. "The garden looks amazing." He would have loved seeing it like this. Then he walked away without waiting for a response, letting himself out through the side gate. Mia watched him go, then looked at me with raised eyebrows. Did that actually just happen? I think it did. First time I've ever seen him respect someone's boundary without arguing. We finished cleaning up in silence, both processing what felt like a small miracle in the middle of ordinary afternoon work. 3 weeks later, Denise called and asked if we could meet for coffee at a neutral location. I brought Ashlyn as a buffer, not sure what to expect after months of limited contact. Denise arrived early, sitting at a corner table with 2 parenting books in front of her, pages marked with dozens of sticky notes. She looked older somehow, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Thank you for coming," she said when I sat down. "I know I don't deserve your time after everything." I listened as she talked about the past year, about finally reading the books Harold left her, and recognizing her own mistakes in every chapter. She'd joined a support group for parents dealing with adult children's entitlement issues, and heard her own story repeated by strangers who enabled their kids the same way she'd enabled Blake. She was seeing a therapist twice a week, and learning that helping Blake meant stopping the help, letting him face real consequences instead of constantly rescuing him from his own choices. "I made him believe the world owed him everything," Denise said, tears running down her face. "And I blamed everyone else when he acted exactly how I taught him to act. I'm not asking you to forgive me or trust me right away. I just wanted you to know I'm working on it. That I finally understand what Dad was trying to tell me with those books." We talked for 2 hours about boundaries and honesty and the difference between enabling and supporting. I didn't promise her anything except that I'd keep the door open if she continued making genuine changes. She accepted that without pushing for more, and I saw echoes of Blake's conversation with Mia in the way she respected my limits. 2 years slid past in a blur of property management and college classes and slow family healing. Mia finished her degree in horticulture and property management, turning her inheritance into a career path that combined passion with practical skill. The house filled with carefully chosen renters who treated the place with respect, their rent covering expenses while Mia built equity and experience. I stood in the kitchen doorway one Sunday afternoon watching her teach her current renters about tomato plants, explaining how to pinch suckers and support heavy fruit exactly the way Harold taught her during those childhood summers. She had his patience with growing things, his steady hands working soil, his genuine pleasure in watching things thrive under careful attention. The renters asked questions and took notes, treating her knowledge with the respect she'd earned through years of consistent care. Harold's greatest inheritance wasn't the house or the property value or the financial security it provided. It was teaching someone how to show up and love through action, how to build family deliberately instead of assuming blood did the work automatically. Mia learned that real relationships require patience and presence and genuine care, repeated every single day until it becomes who you are instead of what you do. The best families aren't the ones we inherit through biology. They're the ones we choose to build through showing up when it matters and staying present when it's hard, and proving through action that love means more than shared DNA or convenient proximity.